commitment and commitment to sanity when it comes to the laws of this country. I want to show some pictures. You'll recognize them. This is Aidan Mccarthy, 2 years old. On the morning of the 4th of July, 16 days ago, Aidan and his parents, Kevin and Arena, went out to celebrate Independence Day as a family. They stopped by their hometown parade in Highland Park. Shortly after 10:14 a.m., Aidan lost both of his parents. It happened when a 21-year-old gunman with a military-style AR-15 rifle began shooting. Aidan's father, Kevin, used his body as a shield to protect Aidan. Kevin and Aidan's mother, Arena, was killed by gunfire. When the shooting stopped, Aidan was found wandering along the parade route with his father's blood smeared on his legs. I first heard about this from Mayor Rotering when I called her after hearing the news, and she talked about Aidan, the little boy they were still trying to identify. This other photo is Cooper Roberts, 8 years old. He was at the parade that day with his twin brother, parents, and a bullet severed his spinal cord. We pray that he will recover. But for the time being, he is battling paralysis from the waist down, and he's undergone at least 7 surgeries as a result of injuries, including one to reclose a bullet wound in his esophagus. Cooper's twin brother, Luke, had to be treated for shrapnel wounds to one of his legs. My heart is broken for these little boys and for their families and all the families mourning their loved ones and struggling to recover from this unspeakable act. Our nation was still reeling from the horrific mass shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas, when the horror came to Highland Park on the 4th of July. 83 rounds fired in less than 60 seconds. The gunman had perched himself on a rooftop and used a Smith & Wesson semi-automatic assault rifle of the AR-15 variety and 3 30-round high-capacity magazines to commit this massacre. He killed 7 people. Their names are Catherine Goldstein, Kevin and Arena McCarthy, Jacqueline Sunday, Stephen Strauss, Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza, and Eduardo Uvaldo. Dozens more were injured. Many are still hospitalized. Thousands experienced a trauma that day that will be with them forever. The attack in Highland Park was the 309th mass shooting in America this year. There have been 47 more mass shootings since the 4th of July. This is a crushing number when you consider its reflection on life in America. And it is disgraceful that we have done so little to stop it. Too often the weapons that are used are military-style assault weapons designed to kill large numbers of people in a matter of seconds. My colleague and the other senator from Illinois, Senator Duckworth, will speak to that issue with their own special personal knowledge of it. I'd like to turn to a short video that shows the threat our communities face from these war weapons, one of which was turned loose on Highland Park.
Indiscriminately fired at the crowd and struck people at random.
Stopping to reload his rifle, similar to this one seen here twice.
The Texas rampage comes just 10 days after another shooting massacre at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York.
Another mass shooting, this time at a church in California on Sunday. There are at least 3 mass shootings here in this country, 212 this year.
In many parts of the U.S., you only have to be 18 years old to purchase a weapon of war, an assault-style rifle like the AR-15.
The style of weapon used in many mass shootings, including the ones in Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, and Uvalde.
Waffle House, AR-15. Buffalo, AR-15. Boulder, Orlando, Parkland, Aurora, Colorado. Midland, Odessa. Poway Synagogue, Tree of Life Synagogue, Sutherland Springs, AR-15.
That's how fast someone can shoot 30 rounds, one magazine from an AR-15?
Those bullets from a high-powered rifle have a velocity of somewhere around 3,000 feet per second.
I am an emergency room doctor. I can tell you firsthand, the damage from an AR-15's bullet is almost indescribable. It creates gaping holes. It liquefies organs.
You can't hunt with an AR-15 and eat the deer afterwards.
And that is what the surgeons and the doctors and the first responders are facing when they are dealing with these mass shooting victims.
They are weapons of war. Why do we allow our citizens to have such easy access to weapons of war?
This is the 10th hearing the Senate Judiciary Committee has held this Congress on how to reduce gun violence in America, the 10th. Today, we'll discuss the threat our communities face when civilians as young as 18 years of age have easy access to military-style assault weapons like AR-15s and no legal requirement for training. How did we get to this point? Why are these killing machines flying off the shelves after they were banned for a decade until 2004? Maybe it's the ads that market the assault weapons, symbols of independence, freedom, or the promise that owning an AR-15 style gun will make you more of a man. Or could it be the enticing prospect of toting around the same style of weapon that soldiers and Marines use to defend our country in combat? These are the marketing tactics used by gun manufacturers like Mossberg, Bushmaster, Daniel Defense. It's time to name and shame these companies. It's a disgrace that they have been shielded from accountability, even liability, for a devastation that's been caused by their products. I called them out on the Senate floor last week, and I'll do it again. These weapons are killing our kids and our neighbors. In America, this land of the free, you can no longer go to the grocery store, a movie theater, 4th of July parade, or send your kids to school without fear of falling victim to another senseless mass shooting. I want those who have lost so much to gun violence to know that I hear you, I see you, I stand with you in this fight for real change that goes beyond thoughts and prayers. Governor Pritzker made a comment after the shooting in Highland Park, which reflected the feelings all of us had. Heartbroken for the victims and families, but furious that a 4th of July parade could turn into a killing field in the United States of America. I want to salute some progress. In the last few weeks, we passed the most significant federal gun safety law in nearly 3 decades. We've also confirmed an ATF director for the first time in 7 years. 7 years. We've got to do more. If we're serious about reducing gun violence, we need to keep weapons of war where they belong, on the battlefield, in the police departments, not in our communities. Today, we have a distinguished panel of witnesses ready to make that case, and I look forward to their testimony. Let me turn to Senator Grassley before recognizing my colleague. Senator Grassley.
Of course, for all of us, it was tragic to hear about the recent shootings in Highland Park, July 4th, just like Buffalo, Uvalde, other places throughout the country. Senseless acts of violence have no place in our country, particularly on a day when we should be celebrating our community and solidarity as people. Our hearts break for victims and the families. As a father and grandfather, I can't imagine what you're going through. Sadly, we witnessed another shooting in Indianapolis over the weekend. Thankfully, a lawfully armed civilian with firearms stopped the shooter before more harm could be done. The gunman at Highland Park shooting was 21 years old, held a valid Illinois firearm owner's identification card. He legally purchased 5 guns in 4 different transactions, passing federal background checks each time. Yet, like several other mass shooters, This perpetrator showed numerous warning signs over the years. He had previous contacts with police. He attempted suicide. A family member reported he threatened to, quote unquote, kill everyone, and his collections of knives were seized, yet he was not arrested, and no red flags were implemented when he purchased a firearm. Illinois has some of the most restrictive gun control laws in the country, but that didn't stop these murders. A young man was showing obvious signs that he is considering violence, but no one knew what these signs were. No one knew what his actions meant. No one interceded. No one stopped him. It would be easy to say that the system just failed, that the police should have done more. His family should have done more. But there actually is something that would have made a difference. We have to educate the institutions in a person's life about these obvious signs of distress, these obvious signs that a person is heading towards mass violence. Schools in many states have implemented threat assessment models, but more institutions, including churches, workplaces, want and need training. We need to take affirmative steps on legislation for threat assessment and prevention services. A study of hundreds of mass shooting incidents conducted by 2 professors show eerie similarities repeated over and over that aren't always recognized. I know every member of this committee has heard me talk about and maybe gets tired of me talking about the Eagles Act. That's named after the Parkland, Florida killing. That Eagles is their school mascot. I first introduced this bill in 2018. It ought to be really non-controversial. This legislation would provide funding to support Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center's efforts to conduct cutting-edge research into the prevention of violence. It would also enable the National Threat Assessment Center to train more of our nation's schools and institutions in conducting threat assessment and early intervention. Eagles is a vitally missing piece that we have to implement if we want to reduce these mass shootings. We can't afford not to do it. We can't keep seeing shooter after shooter follow the same predictable path and nobody does anything about it. It could be because they didn't know what they were looking at, or they didn't know what to do. We have to fill this information gap with public education. Right now, the National Threat Assessment Center can't afford to train everyone who wants this information. That has to change. I'm pleading for that to change. I'm not alone in these thoughts. Eagles is co-sponsored by 10 of my fellow senators representing both political parties. I will also be submitting a statement from the United States Secret Service Association supporting this legislation. I know many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't like guns. Some are not particularly impressed by the appeals of Americans who desperately worry that one-size-fits-all gun control will impede their right to self-defense. I've spoken with many who are worried about restrictions on their right to self-defend. I will be submitting for the record statements from the Asia Pacific Gun Owners Association and a family member of one of the victims from the shooting in Highland Park, both who are very concerned about restrictions being imposed on their right to self-defend. For those who see no need for an armed citizenry, the solution to mass shootings could include a ban on assault weapons. This has already been tried in the 90s and early 2000s. I didn't support it then, and these bans would be ineffective and not consistent with the right of self-defense. 2004 Department of Justice study concluded that after 10 years of assault weapons ban, there was no statistically significant evidence that banning assault weapons reduced gun murders. We also know restricting gun control will hurt vulnerable communities that need to defend themselves against the horrible spike in violent crime that began 2 years ago. According to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the primary trade association for gun industry, gun sales during the first half of 2020 increased year over year, 52% for whites, 59% for African Americans, 49% for Hispanic, 42 to 43% for Asians. These numbers continue to grow, and restricted gun control that only affects law-abiding citizens will affect this new population of gun owners. I hope my colleagues know that I'm always going to want to talk about solutions to keep communities safe, but these have to be solutions based on evidence that respect the need for self-defense. There are bipartisan things we can do, and I hope the Eagles Act will be one of them, and I hope that will be very soon. I yield.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I want to acknowledge, and I'm sure I'm going to miss someone in this incredible turnout on behalf of Highland Park, Lake County, and Illinois, but I want to acknowledge the presence of State Representative Bob Morgan, Lake County Sheriff John Eidelberg, the State's Attorney from Lake County, Eric Reinhardt, Daniel Shapiro, whom I met a little earlier, Mayor of Deerfield, Sandy Hart, the Lake County Board Chair, and Catherine Sisla, I hope I get close to pronouncing your name correctly, from Northbrook, Lauren Beth Gash, and I know that Mayor Rotering will be introduced in just a moment. We'll have two opening statements, one from Senator Duckworth and then another from Senator Cornyn, and I'll recognize Senator Duckworth first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, thank you for holding today's very important hearing. It's been 16 days since Good Samaritans found 2-year-old Aidan Mccarthy lying bloodied and pinned beneath his unconscious father in the chaotic aftermath of the deadly mass shooting at Highland Park's 4th of July parade. Just a toddler, Aidan had somehow lost one shoe and was down to just one blood-soaked sock as he kept asking for his mom and dad. But tragically, we learned that Irina and Kevin McCarthy were among the 7 people murdered in what has become a uniquely American phenomenon. Mass murderers wielding weapons of war to inflict terror and death upon innocent Americans. My constituents, and yours as well, Mr. Chairman, were eager to celebrate America at her best. Instead, they joined a rapidly growing number of victims who've experienced our nation at her worst. I still can't get the image of Aidan's one bloodied sock out of my mind. I'm unable to stop thinking about what his future holds now, or what his parents' final thoughts might have been as they shielded their son from bullets raining down with their own bodies. And that's why I'm here this morning. As the senator representing Aidan, I refuse to let my colleagues ignore how a weapon of war forever changed this little boy's life and the lives of so many others. And as a mom raising 2 little girls who are attending school, I refuse to do nothing in the face of a deadly epidemic of gun violence that is now the leading cause of death of young Americans. Let me say that now. The leading cause of death of Americans under the age of 16 in this country isn't cancer, isn't car accidents, it's gun violence. Only in America. I'm urging this committee to demonstrate courage in supporting a ban on assault weapons and large capacity magazines. We can't stop every mass shooting. The ranking member spoke about identifying those with mental health issues. I agree we should do all of that. There are predictable steps that he mentioned. That is part of it. But part of those predictable steps also includes, unfortunately, in recent years, the purchasing or the building of assault weapons. It doesn't change the simple fact. After the assault weapons ban expired in 2004, and the ranking member quoted statistics from 2004 that says there had been no significant change as of 2004. However, since that ban was allowed to expire, mass shootings in this country has tripled. We have more recent data, and the data shows that mass shootings in this nation has tripled since the assault weapons ban was allowed to expire. Now, I want to be clear. Restoring the assault weapons ban would not prevent sportsmen from continuing to access more than 2,000 models of powerful hunting rifles. We are not talking about your 30-06s. No mass shooter is going to grab a 30-06 to go and conduct a mass shooting. They're grabbing AR-15s, or they're buying the lower assemblies and then building their own weapons of war. It won't stop a parent from teaching their child to shoot with a .22 like my daddy did with me when I was just 7 years old. I grew up shooting. I enjoy going to the range. But my enjoyment of going to the range should not outweigh a child's right to life, to live free from the scourge of assault weapons. My focus is on ridding our streets of a rifle that Eugene Stoner literally designed to meet Army requirements for use in combat. When he designed the AR-15, it was then adopted by the military to become the M16. The AR-15, it then was adopted by the Army to become the M16 that I carried as my weapon of war for my 23 years as a soldier. Large capacity magazines also need to be banned. These are the items that are fueling the rising rates of mass shootings. The Armalite Rifle 15 and the semi-auto successors it spawned are weapons of war. From their portability, accuracy, rate of fire, ability to penetrate certain body armor, and ease of reloading, both the military-issued M4 carbine and the civilian AR-15 and its variants are functionally similar, and they are designed for combat. The lack of a 3-round burst or a full auto mechanism does not meaningfully reduce the AR-15's lethality compared to the M4. Whether it's a soldier engaging the enemy in combat or an untrained mass murderer hunting children in a school, any shooter looking to efficiently kill multiple people without wasting ammunition will prefer a semi-auto rifle coupled with a detachable large capacity magazine that enables rapid reloading. It chambers the round that quickly as you can pull the trigger, it is chambering a new round. Every senator on this committee should study what happens to a body when struck by a round traveling at a speed of greater than 3,000 feet per second. As that emergency room doctor said, it liquefies your organs, liquefies them. You have no chance of survival. You should seek out emergency room doctors who can show you what happens when a round penetrates a human body at high velocity and tumbles around, exploding tissues and destroying those vital organs. It is one thing to read in horror that the Sandy Hook and Uvalde families had to wait hours to learn the fate of their bodies. But have each of you truly reflected on why the parents had to submit DNA tests to identify their murdered children? Have you imagined how it would feel when authorities told you that you could not view the body of your murdered child, of your baby, because there was nothing left of your baby that you could use to visually identify them? And please, could you submit some DNA? I beg you to question your assumptions about whether weaponry designed for war should be marketed and sold to civilians. What I'm asking this committee to do is not easy, but our children's lives are worth the fight. We all swore an oath to defend the Constitution, which was established to ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for future generations. Well, I was in the Emergency Operations Center immediately following the shooting in Highland Park. And let me tell you, allowing corporations to flood our communities with weapons of war has made a mockery of that sacred preamble. And I, on my way here, looked at Anderson Manufacturing in Kentucky, where they are currently selling the kit for the lower parts with pistol grip, mil-spec for an AR-15 for $59.99. This is what we're talking about. Manufacturers taking advantage and making a profit on dead babies. We sure as hell didn't secure the blessings of liberty for Catherine Goldstein, Jacqueline Sunheim, Stephen Strauss, Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza, Eduardo Uvaldo, and Reina and Kevin McCarthy, or for the countless Americans who were nowhere near Highland Park, but who will now think twice before bringing their child to a hometown July 4th parade. Or the millions of students, like my baby girl, Miley, who I recently witnessed taking part in an active shooters drill. I was at her school to talk about Memorial Day, with her sister's class, and I looked through the window, and I saw the line of preschoolers walking down the hallway, and I watched, and my heart broke as I watched as my little girl was taught to crouch down with her head against a wall, covering her head with her hands in their secure location, knowing full well that a shooter with an AR-15 coming in there, she would not have a chance, no matter what her crouching position was. America's heartbreaking new normal, where we routinely ingrain in our children the traumatizing fear that on any day, at any moment, they could be gunned down in their classroom, should not be acceptable to any one of us. We don't have to live this way. We can still hunt. We can still have an armed citizenry. We can still go to the range. We can still take our kids out and shoot, teach them target practice. We can do all of that without weapons of war, being available for $59.99. I'm ready to restore the federal assault weapons ban, and I beg every member of this committee, please, for the sake of all of our babies, join me in this effort. Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, Senator Duckworth. I know you have other things to attend. Your testimony today was particularly impactful, particularly with the audience here of our constituents. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud of the fact that the United States Congress responded to the voices of people across America following the recent shooting in Uvalde, Texas, who said, do something. Indeed, I believe that doing nothing was a dishonor, would be to dishonor those who wanted us to do something to deal with incidents like occurred in Uvalde and have occurred in numerous other places around the country. Along with Senator Tillis, I was one of the principal negotiators with Senator Sinema and Senator Murphy of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I always said that the test of that legislation will it save lives? And I believe it will. That, I believe, should be the test of any legislative action we take. In addition to focusing on the profile of some of the alienated young men who lash out, not only committing suicide themselves, but taking the lives of others, we tried to figure out how to get at people who are suffering from mental health crises, who none of us believe should have access to firearms. Indeed, under current law, somebody with a mental health adjudication cannot pass a background check, or keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. I believe that the Second Amendment and good public policy are not mutually exclusive. And that's what we tried to do in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. We also made the single largest investment in community-based mental health care in American history, something I believe that will save more young people who are going through a mental health crisis, getting them access to treatment, counseling, medication, whatever it takes to help them live productive lives. And I believe the money that we invested in making our schools safer will pay off. I don't think any parent ought to have to send their child to school worried for their safety. I don't think any child should have to go to school worried about their safety. So I'm proud of the work we've done, and I'm proud of the work we have done before that in improving the background check system, the so-called fixed NICS, or National Instant Criminal Background Check System, following the Sutherland Springs shooting. But one thing I am unwilling to do is to erode the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. Law-abiding citizens are not going to commit these heinous acts. They're not going to commit crimes. They're not going to be suffering from a mental health crisis and lash out and be a danger to themselves or others. And so I wonder about the focus on the firearm as an inanimate object. An inanimate object won't cause harm to anyone What does matter is the person possessing that firearm. And certainly our focus has been keeping them out of the hands of people with criminal records and people with mental health problems. One of the things I worry about is the focus on the firearm that we've heard so far deflects our attention from other places where I think we could make a substantial difference. Things like focusing on the criminals that committed 836 homicides last year in Chicago alone. You know, this came in the wake of the defund the police movement and the so-called Ferguson effect, where law enforcement officers were blamed as opposed to the criminals that committed violent and illegal acts. I don't hear any commentary about the 108,000 Americans who died of drug overdoses last year alone. All of those drugs come across the southern border. Virtually all of the drugs come across the southern border, yet we have an open border. The cartels have figured out how to flood the zone with migrants and deflect the attention of law enforcement officers while the drugs flow across. And it is the criminal gangs in cities across America that commit most of the acts of violence using guns, protecting their market share in their territory, lashing out and killing innocent people. So I think, as horrific as these incidents are, one of the object lessons, I think, of what happened in Highland Park is the strictest gun laws in the nation did not prevent this terrible act. And I think if we focus just on the instrumentality, on the tool, on the inanimate object, and divert our attention from these other contributing factors to these terrible crimes and terrible acts, that we are missing a possible solution to the problem. And I would just finally close, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your generosity in letting me make this statement. It's not lost on me that in Sutherland Springs, Stephen Williford, this was a little Baptist church outside of San Antonio, my hometown, 2017, somebody who was able to buy a firearm illegally because he'd been convicted of a felony, domestic violence, and been committed for mental health problems. Somebody who disqualified from being able to buy a firearm was able to buy one because the United States Air Force did not upload that information in the background check system. But the person who saved lives that day was a man named Stephen Williford, an NRA shooting instructor who took his AR-15 from his gun safe when he heard shooting at Sutherland Springs and went down there and stopped the shooter. We saw that happen again in Indiana, where a Good Samaritan was able to limit the damage that the shooter was able to cause, because these are law-abiding citizens exercising their Second Amendment rights. So I worry that if our focus is simply on the instrumentality, on the firearm itself, an inanimate object, to the detriment of these other contributing factors, that we will have missed the point. Maybe we will have stayed on our talking points, but it will not allow us to reduce the carnage that we're seeing in cities across the country and regions across the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. The first panel of witnesses, I'm going to welcome to the table in just a moment. We'll have 5 minutes of testimony from each, and then they'll be open for questions from members of the committee in 5-minute rounds. So I'd ask if the witnesses on the first panel would all approach the table. If you could stand, please, and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I'll introduce the majority party witnesses, and Senator Grassley will introduce the minority party witnesses. Our first witness is Nancy Rotering, Mayor of Highland Park, Illinois. She served as chief executive of her city since 2011. She was at the Highland Park 4th of July parade when her community was attacked. She has worked tirelessly to help coordinate the response and recovery, console grieving families, and help her community recover. Years earlier, Mayor Rotering led efforts to pass a municipal ordinance banning military-style assault weapons in Highland Park, an ordinance that was challenged in court by the gun lobby, and an ordinance that was upheld by the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. Thanks for being with us, Mayor Rotering. Dr. Kailan Hunter is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. She previously served as director of the Strategy and Warfare Center at the U.S. Air Force Academy, as associate director of the Institute for Future Conflict, and as a professor of military and strategic studies. Dr. Hunter is a Marine Corps combat veteran with multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan as an AH-1W Super Cobra attack pilot. Dr. Hunter, thank you for your service to America, and we're glad to have you. Joseph Bloker is a professor and co-director of the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University School of Law. Professor Bloker has taught at Duke since 2009. His scholarship focuses on the issues of gun rights and regulation. Before joining the Duke faculty, he clerked for the 2nd and 11th Circuits and practiced law at O'Malvaney and Myers LLP, where he assisted with the merits briefing for the District of Columbia in District of Columbia versus Heller. Now I'll turn to Senator Grassley to introduce his witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to tell you that at 11 I've got time on the floor to speak, and so I'll come back and ask my questions later on.
That's fine. Thank you.
Russell Bentley is a senior analyst with Safe Haven International, the world's largest nonprofit K-12 school safety center. Mr. Bentley has over 20 years of law enforcement experience with 15 years in executive positions within campus police agencies. He is a 2001 graduate of the FBI National Academy and contributing author to the textbook Extreme Violence, Understanding and Protecting People from Active Assailants, Hate Crimes, and Terrorist Attacks. I thank you for being with us, Mr. Bentley. And my next person to introduce is Philip T. Smith. Is founder and president of the National African American Gun Association, a group he created in 2015 with the mission of educating and training African Americans in firearm safety, sportsmanship, and lawful defensive firearm use. His association is a 48,000 active members. It's a strong organization with 127 chapters located throughout 39 states and the District of Columbia. Welcome to you, Mr. Smith.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. We'll first recognize our first witness, Nancy Rotering. Mayor Rotering.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss today how we stop mass shootings. My name is Nancy Rotering. I'm the mayor of Highland Park, Illinois, an all-American Midwestern town. I was at the Highland Park 4th of July parade shooting, and I will be haunted forever. Before I tell you my story, I want to recognize the brave police and fire personnel who ran directly into danger to save lives. They did everything right. They miraculously caught the shooter within hours, and they are what true American heroes look like. It was a perfect summer day. The excitement of 3,000 parade goers was palpable, especially since this was our first parade in 2 years post-pandemic. Festive floats, a sea of children and adults in red, white, and blue waving American flags. At 10 a.m., my council and I kicked off our parade. Music and cheering were all we could hear as we headed down the street. I looked left and waved to my husband in the crowd. What I didn't know at that moment was that just to my right, on a one-story rooftop, a 21-year-old was preparing to traumatize my hometown forever with an assault weapon. Shortly after we proceeded down the parade route, I turned to my colleagues and I questioned why the marching band had stopped playing music and was only playing a drum cadence. Tat, 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 tat. I then saw a sea of marching band members sprinting down the sidewalk, some with tubas still entwined around their bodies. I realized later that the sound I had heard wasn't drum cadence, it was the sound of an assault weapon. My cell phone buzzed, and a shooter on the roof of a local store had shot dozens of rounds into the parade crowd. Fire and police vehicles were roaring towards us. We pivoted and started an emergency evacuation. We were screaming, "Run, shooter!" Adults stared back, not comprehending, but the kids knew immediately this wasn't a drill, and they yelled to everybody, "Run," and hide. They knew what was happening. Grandparents were running for cover, toddlers were being placed in dumpsters for safety, and the bodies of those who were hit were scattered on the ground. We now know that 22-year-old Cassie Goldstein told her mom, Katie, to run, but Katie was hit in the chest, and Cassie had to tell her mother she loved her, but she couldn't stop because bullets were still flying. She kept running to safety, hiding behind a garbage can, and when the shooting stopped, Cassie returned to find her mother lifeless. Local doctors and volunteer community emergency response teams covered the dead and tended to the severely wounded as paramedics arrived. The shooter was still at large. A photo of a teary-eyed toddler clutching a blanket flashed on my phone. Whose child was this? People were hiding in an underground garage, wondering why nobody was looking for this missing child. Later, we learned that it was 2-year-old Aidan Mccarthy with dried blood on his legs, socks, and his tiger sneaker. He had been found under his father's body and carried to safety. No one was frantically looking for him because both his mother and father had been murdered at the parade. Governor J.B. Pritzker and I attended the funerals. We heard about Jackie Sondheim's love of knitting and Eduardo Uvaldo missing his 70th birthday just 4 days later on July 8th. We heard how hot shrapnel had melted into the arms and legs of his relatives. Stephen Strauss's widow asked, was he unconscious? Was he alone? And the response was no. Police Commander Jerry Cameron did CPR and stayed with him the entire time. Several of Nicholas Toledo's grandchildren attended his funeral on crutches, gunshot victims themselves. The impact of the gunfire on their grandfather required a closed casket. Sitting with him at the parade, they experienced firsthand the gory effect that this ammunition with this velocity has when hitting a human head. Dr. Keely Roberts left the hospital immediately after her own major surgery to be with her 8-year-old son, Cooper, whose shredded esophagus, ripped liver, and severed spinal cord continue to threaten his life. His twin brother, Luke, was shot in the leg. Liz Turnipseed's 3-year-old daughter was handed to strangers while Liz was rushed to the hospital because a bullet pierced her pelvis. She has shrapnel in her leg, and she may never walk unassisted again. Less than a minute is all it took for a person with an assault weapon to shoot 83 rounds into a crowd, forever changing so many lives. And the most disturbing part, this is the norm in our country. Highland Park had the uniquely American experience of a 4th of July parade turn into what has now become a uniquely American experience of a mass shooting. How do we call this freedom? Other advanced nations live free of fear of gun violence, and we know that mental health issues exist everywhere in our world. American mayors, and I've talked to several in these past few weeks, fear not if, but when a mass shooting is going to hit our towns. What's different about the U.S.? U.S. has civilian access to assault weapons and large capacity magazines. That is the only differentiating factor. In 2013, in the wake of Sandy Hook, we as a city banned assault weapons and large capacity magazines. We knew that a federal ban would be the most effective, but a local ban reflecting the values of our community was our only option under the law. Local governments cannot do this alone. Congress must take action. You must federally ban assault weapons and large capacity magazines. Today is the day to start saving lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Rotering. Mr. Bentley.
Chairman Durbin.
Would you check your microphone, sir? Thank you.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and other honorable members of the Judicial Committee. I appreciate your concern for school safety, and I'm grateful to have an opportunity to do my best to try to assist you in your important efforts. My name is Russell Bentley. I'm here on behalf of the world's largest K-12 safe school center, Safe Havens International Incorporated. Safe Havens is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-governmental organization whose analysts have worked in all 50 states, U.S. territories, in over 24 countries with a goal of helping to make schools safer wherever students happen to live and attend school. Safe haven analysts have assisted the U.S. Departments of Education, Justice, Homeland Security, and have provided assistance to school safety efforts of the administrations of President William Clinton, President George Bush Jr., and President Barack Obama, as well as governmental agencies in Canada, India, Israel, Poland, Vietnam, and Trinidad and Tobago, to make schools safer for students and those who dedicate their lives to educating them. I've been a full-time school safety practitioner for more than 32 years and have worked in K-12 school districts, faith-based, charter, and independent schools in over 30 states. My main message for you today is that while there are many things that can make schools safer, I would like to see greater access to and utilization of the immense, excellent, and unparalleled school safety resources that have been developed by a host of federal government agencies over the past 3 decades. The U.S. Departments of Education, Justice, Homeland Security, the United States Secret Service, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency, and other federal agencies and departments have worked tirelessly to develop what I feel is superb resources and programs that are available at no cost to our nation's schools. However, during our school safety, security, climate, culture, and emergency preparedness assessments of more than 8,500 K-12 schools and our official post-incident assistance for 23 active assailant and targeted shootings in K-12 schools, we have found that many school districts and non-public schools still lack some extremely effective and important prevention measures. One particular is my experience with student threat assessment and management. Working with school social worker Mitch Mitchell in the early 1990s, I was a deputy chief of school police. Our department developed what is likely the first multiple disciplinary threat assessment team, which helped to avert tragedies, including a planned middle school bombing by a deeply troubled student who espoused Nazi beliefs and desired to kill African-American students. We had such success with this approach, and using federal grants, we formed 2 full-time student intervention teams with school social workers and school district police working out of patrol cars in each team. Since that time, multiple federal agencies and subject matter experts from various sectors have dramatically advanced student threat assessment and management processes. Unlike many other approaches, threat assessment and management teams offer significant protection from attacks regardless of the type of weapons used, the time of day, the location of the attack. They help protect students and school employees in classrooms, lunchrooms, media centers, school grounds, school buses, and athletic events. While there are many other things that can and do make our nation's schools safer, I would urge you to do what you can to enable the National Threat Assessment Center of the Secret Service to build upon this incredible important body of knowledge and the work of so many under the inspired leadership of both parties, and to provide the center with additional resources to provide greater support to our nation's public and non-public schools. I have immense faith in the ability of the dedicated men and women of the center to improve our ability to prevent planned acts of school violence. Thank you for your service to our nation and allowing me to share my thoughts with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Bentley. Dr. Hunter?
Thank you.
Does not seem, there we go, we got over there. All right, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. Before I begin, I do want to recognize the residents of Highland Park who are here with us in the audience, and as a combat veteran, acknowledge that the sounds and images you may have heard would have been very troubling given your recent experience, and I thank you for your bravery staying in the audience through that. We owe it to the victims of gun violence, their families, and the American people to ensure that gun violence prevention policy is based on objective facts. Actionable solutions only come when we are willing to take a clear-eyed look at the state of the science. And that includes looking at the role of assault weapons, or commonly called modern sporting rifles, in mass shootings. Today, I will present to you what is known about these weapons and their role in mass shooting events so that you can make informed policy decisions that will keep our communities safer. I will do this by addressing 3 points. First, these weapons have an outsized impact on injury and death. Second, I will share what we know and can logically infer about the efficacy of assault weapons bans. And third, I'll discuss why it is essential to ensure access to quality research. Assault weapons have an outsized impact on injury and death. Thankfully, these weapons are used in the minority of firearm homicides. However, they are disproportionately used in mass shootings, particularly public mass shootings, which the FBI has shown rose by 50% from 2020 to 2021. When an assault weapon is used in one of these shootings, there are more than 14 times more injuries and twice as many deaths than when any other type of weapon is used. And it's because these weapons were designed to kill as many people as quickly as possible. As Senator Duckworth said, they are descendants of Armalite's AR-15 design that was created in the 1950s and adopted in the mid-1960s as the M16 service weapon. This weapon has been used by service members in every conflict since Vietnam. I use them as a Marine. And as a service weapon, they have several advantages. They're lighter weight, they're shorter, they have lighter bullets, they can shoot more bullets more quickly, and their bullets are designed to do damage to the human body and even shoot through a standard issue military helmet. In short, it is a great service weapon. Indeed, the very design of this firearm and the benefit it brings to this intended purpose may be responsible for its outsized impact on injury and death in mass shootings. Second, what does research and logic tell us? Studies on the impact of previous federal or current state assault weapon policies are few. So it is important that we use logical deductions to consider carefully the impact of these bans. While there is little evidence that the ban on assault weapons reduces the overall incidence of crime, knowing that they do result in larger levels of injury and death, given that we know this, we can infer that they will significantly reduce the numbers of injuries and deaths. There is also research to show that states with stronger gun laws have lower levels of all types of gun violence. But states and localities, to include Highland Park, which has an assault weapons ban, are limited in their ability to protect their communities. There are no hard borders between cities or states. And what limited trace data we do have show that weapons flow from areas of more permissive laws to areas with more restrictive laws. Finally, the fact that we have limited, rigorous scholarship on the efficacy of these bans should not be taken to mean that these policies do not reduce injuries and deaths, but that there is just little available research. And a portion of this can be traced to the lack of federal investment and inability of researchers to access essential data. The effort to prevent research on this topic has resulted in a lack of understanding and discussions that devolve into partisan talking points rather than a meaningful discussion of the facts. Between 1997 and 2019, federal funding on gun violence prevention research was virtually nothing. And over this 20-year dearth of funding has put gun policy science far behind all of our other complex public health issues that we have evidence-based solutions for in this country. Access to quality data, notably trace data from the ATF, has also been stymied by the federal government. Enacting new gun laws requires a balance between public safety and individual rights. Access to firearm trace data is an essential tool to understand how guns get into the hands of criminals, including mass shooters. Members of this committee have repeatedly called for laws that target prosecuting felons trying to buy illegal guns. And we know that 1 in 3 mass shooters are committed by an individual who is prohibited from purchasing a firearm. Yet we as researchers are unable to use trace data to study patterns and trends to help inform a supply-side approach that will prevent criminals from accessing guns, to include criminals on the other side of the border, and thereby keep our communities safer. We owe it to our fellow Americans to make policy decisions based on what we know. We know that the presence of these weapons in the hands of mass shooters increases injury and death. If there is decision to act, states and localities may be challenged to act on their own. And we know that the best way to make good policy is to have good research, and that prohibitions on research continue to cost lives. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. Mr. Smith?
You can hear me? Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the committee, my name is Philip T. Smith, and I'm honored to testify today. As the president of a firearms organization, this is a needed national conversation regarding firearms, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. A little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Vallejo, California, and graduated from the University of California, Davis. I am married to my lovely wife, Gwen Smith, of 20-plus years, and have 3 kids. And I'm also a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. I am the president and founder of the National African American Gun Association. We are the largest black firearms organization in the history of the United States and have grown to over 48,000 members with 120 chapters and members in every state. We are a pro-2A, pro-constitutional carry, and a pro-black firearms organization with no apologies. We have grown tremendously in 7 years with a diverse base of folks joining. You name it, and we have that person within our organization. What is especially significant is the surge of black women joining. Yes, black women are coming, and they are coming in large numbers. Currently, they are the fastest group of new gun owners in the United States, and I'm proud to say they are the backbone of the National African American Gun Association. Never before have this many black people in the United States had guns. It is estimated that at least 14 million currently have firearms in their homes. What is happening is that our community has awoken, and we are taking steps to protect ourselves legally. Today at this hearing, I am representing the millions of black people in this country, past and present, that have been unable to seize the opportunity to protect themselves through the Second Amendment. I will be their voice. I will be their defender. The history of black Americans in this country is well documented, with slavery being a social and legal burden that we had to fight. But what isn't as well known is that there were laws called the Black Code starting in 1865 that prevented black folks from owning any type of firearm in their possession. If a black person was caught with a gun, they could be killed, no questions asked, on the spot. The goal of these laws were to keep the black community under control and defenseless. Today, in 2022, restricting American citizens from purchasing firearms has the same effect as the Black Codes of 1865. The end result is people, especially black folks, are unable to secure a gun, which leaves them vulnerable. To me, that is unacceptable and un-American. The recent Supreme Court decision, New York State Rifle and Pistol versus Bruin, will now allow millions of gun owners whose rights were restricted to exercise those rights, as crime has significantly larger impact on black communities. It is even more important we have the ability to defend ourselves, exactly as the decision affirmed. Focusing on banning rifles like the AR-15 is an exercise in futility. It is in direct conflict with the Second Amendment, robs us of our right to use the best tools available to defend ourselves, and will only result in those who have access to the money and privilege of private security and the means to defend themselves. The misinformation about the AR-15 is incredible, with public figures making statements that have no truth or facts about the firearm. Let me demystify the firearm right now so we all can be on the same page. The AR-15 is not a fully automatic machine gun like the M16 used by the military. It is a semi-automatic rifle. In other words, you pull the trigger once and only one bullet comes out. Just like a pistol, just like a shotgun. Banning the AR-15 will not have any impact on violence. Studies have already shown this from the previous ban in the 90s. Bad people with bad intent will still have guns to cause harm to our most vulnerable Americans, black Americans. You can't pass laws to solve the human condition of violence or evil. We must look at the root cause of these shootings, and that requires tough, uncomfortable conversations within our nation. Thank you for allowing me to address this committee and this serious subject matter in our country today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Professor Bloker.
Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Joseph Bloker. I am the Lanty L. Smith Professor of Law at Duke Law School, where I also co-direct the Center for Firearms Law. I am testifying here today purely in my individual capacity. As this committee considers laws and policies to keep Americans safe from the risk and reality of devastating mass shootings like what happened in Highland Park on July 4th, it does so in the wake of the Supreme Court's recent decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. That case announced a new legal test governing constitutional challenges to any new gun laws that Congress or states may pass, as well as to laws already on the books, including Highland Park's municipal assault weapons ban, which survived an earlier Second Amendment challenge. How the Bruin test is applied will have a significant impact on efforts to protect public safety, and it is therefore critically important that the committee and the American people understand the new judicial framework. In my brief remarks, I want to focus on 2 points in particular. The first is that Justice Thomas's majority opinion adopts a new test for evaluating the constitutionality of gun laws under the Second Amendment. According to the court, the constitutionality of modern firearms regulations designed to address contemporary real-world problems will now depend solely on whether they are, in some sense, consistent with historical tradition and not on whether they are effective in preventing serious harms. Properly applied, such a test should still uphold most modern gun laws because regulation of deadly weapons is part of the common law tradition since before this nation's founding. Historians have written volumes on the topic, and the Duke Center for Firearms Law hosts the Repository of Historical Gun Laws, which has in it more than 1,500 illustrative historical regulations. But the court's new test does open the door to an enormous amount of judicial discretion because the court has done little to explain how we are supposed to determine whether a modern law is relevantly similar to an historical one. Days after the decision, a case was filed here in D.C. challenging the prohibition on guns in the metro. Is the metro relevantly similar to the medieval fairs and markets where weapons were heavily regulated? Similar questions will arise to any number of Second Amendment cases. Are the AR-15s that we've been discussing relevantly similar to muzzle-loading flintlock muskets? Are domestic abusers, prohibited under federal law today, relevantly similar to groups who were disarmed at the founding? Mr. Smith just spoke of another reason to be skeptical of the historical record, which is that prior generations disarmed groups, including Black Americans, Native Americans, and those who refused to take loyalty oaths. Drawing analogies between that historical record and contemporary challenges will involve a great deal of judicial discretion in defining the scope of the inquiry and in choosing historical comparators. It introduces substantial uncertainty and will make the content of Second Amendment law even more obscure to the hundreds of millions of people whose lives are governed by it. But my second point is that despite its methodological weakness, Bruin does not mean the end of gun safety legislation. The court majority emphasized that it was only striking down New York's law, and in fact it specifically approved alternative forms of licensing for concealed carry, such as shall-issue laws that provide more objective criteria for licenses. Concurring opinions by Justices Alito and Kavanaugh, the latter joined by Chief Justice Roberts, emphasized that properly interpreted, the Second Amendment allows a potentially wide variety of gun regulations. In evaluating whether those laws are analogous to modern ones, courts will have to ask, as Bruin says, whether they are relevantly similar, especially with respect to how and why they burden people's ability to have guns. And to determine whether something is relevantly similar not only permits, but in fact requires the kind of contemporary evidence that this committee is considering today. It is simply impossible, as a matter of law or logic, to compare modern gun laws to historical ones without evidence about the former. The court's decision in Bruin is problematic and disruptive to constitutional law, but it is not the end of evidence-based gun policy or of the important work of this committee. Senator Cornyn, earlier you said the Second Amendment and good public policy are not exclusive. That is true, and it remains true after Bruin. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Bloker. Mayor Rotering, the gun lobby often claims the best way to stop mass shooters is to have lots of people to carry guns, so bystanders can engage a mass shooter and shoot them as well. course, that approach is good for the gun lobby's goal of selling more guns. The New York Times recently looked at 433 active shooter attacks since the year 2000 to see how many times a bystander stopped a mass shooter. It happened 22 times out of 433 mass shootings, about 5%. 10 of those incidents, half of them, involved a bystander who happened to be a security guard or an off-duty police officer. So it can happen, though it's pretty rare statistically, and we must remember that many states have concealed carry or open carry with no requirement of training whatsoever. My question to you is this: how much can we count on a good guy with a gun to stop a mass shooter when the mass shooter has an AR-15 style assault weapon that it can empty a 30-round magazine in about as many seconds?
A good guy with a gun would have had no impact on the shooter. We have heard from hundreds of parade goers, and they all had hundreds of explanations of where the shooting had come from. They could not identify even where the shooter was, the area where this took place. There were bullets ricocheting off of walls. There was a courtyard, and we had good guys with guns on site who were trained, who got there within seconds, and it was just too hard to see where he was. We also know that these weapons and these bullets can pierce Kevlar vests. I think the fact that we had less than a minute should tell anybody who thought that a good guy with a gun would have had an impact. The only thing that would have happened would have been more chaos, more carnage. You would have had people shooting all over the place. That absolutely would have been a disaster in Highland Park.
So technically, your police and law enforcement were outgunned by this shooter in Highland Park.
They were, and literally, because it was so quick, they got there within seconds. But again, hundreds of people had hundreds of explanations. My own husband was right there. He thought the shooter had been on the street. He was right in the middle of it all. Everybody gave different stories.
Professor Bloker, you read the Bruin opinion, and I have as well. What does it say about potentially banning assault weapons or requiring official training in the weapon before you can own one?
Nothing directly. The court's very clear that it is ruling only on the legality of may issue public carry restrictions like the one that New York had in place and other populous states do as well. The court, the majority, and the concurring opinions are very clear that the Second Amendment still permits various forms of gun regulation, perhaps including those, or certainly those involving certain kinds of arms. I think that the question going forward will be about the historical analogs. In the lead up to Bruin, prohibitions on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines had been universally upheld in the federal courts. There were some lower court and panel opinions that had called them into question, all of them held pending Bruin. Now, I think the litigation will be about whether assault weapons constitute the kind of dangerous and unusual weapons which the court in Heller and again in Bruin emphasized can be prohibited consistent with the Second Amendment. I suspect that's where most of the litigation will be, and the evidence that you're hearing today is probative on that question.
Let me stick with the inanimate object argument, which we've heard. It's just a piece of material, weaponry, plastics and steel and so forth. And I wonder how that logic applies to grenade launchers. We don't allow those to be legally sold to Americans. They are just inanimate objects. We don't allow automatic weapons to be sold to Americans, which holding the trigger continues to fire round after round after round. Could you describe whether you think there's an analogy?
I think that weapons and firearms in particular intensify violence, and generations now of research have shown us that. Dr. Hunter had spoken to this earlier, that certain kinds of gun restrictions may not lessen the number of criminal incidents, but what they do is, what weapons do is intensify the violence that's inflicted. That's the nature of the instrument. That's why some people want them for self-defense. That's why some criminals want them for criminal use. And so I think there's not much to the idea that the instrument alone is inert. Of course it is, but the question is, what happens with that instrument in various situations, whether it's being put to good use or bad.
Thank you. Senator Fines?
Thank you, Mr.
I'm
Chairman.
sorry. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Senator Cornyn just returned.
Sorry.
Senator Cornyn?
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, you talked about the increase in the number of African Americans who purchase firearms, including African American women, in the recent past. What do you attribute that to?
Thank you for the question, Senator. It's multifaceted, but the one overriding thing that I'm seeing from my perch as the president of the organization is that black women, like all Americans, feel that they need to be able to protect themselves. They're not waiting for some guy on a white horse to fly in and save them. They want to be able to protect themselves. If someone breaks into their home at 2 o'clock in the morning, they don't have the time to tell the robber or someone who's breaking their home, hold on, wait a second, let me call the police. They have to be able to deal with that threat right then and there, and that's what they're doing. Women en masse are taking upon themselves to be very independent and self-reliant, and they are purchasing firearms.
Where do you live?
I live outside of Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. Are you familiar with the fact that last year alone there were 836 homicides in Chicago?
I understand Chicago is a very interesting place in terms of violence, yes.
Do you have an opinion whether that violence is predominantly caused by criminal street gangs?
I've talked about this many times in many conversations and interviews. If we're really serious about helping poor folks, and let's be specific, we're talking about poor black and brown folks. Give them jobs. Take away super incarceration of them at an earlier age where they have 2 or 3 felonies by the time they're 23 and 24 years of age. Give them the ability to go out and secure employment. Those folks out there are doing what anyone else would do. If you can't find a job, they'll sell drugs, they'll beat people up, they'll do whatever it takes to take care of those babies that they have at home, and they have kids at home. But we have to, as a country, to save them, is to do something other than say, well, those guys are bad, let's just throw them in jail, when again and again, more and more are coming like them. We have to think holistically to get a solution. And for me, my personal belief, and I'm not a scholar like some of the folks on this table, but I'm a black man who's 63 years of age, has been in this country for a long time. And if you give folks employment, if you give them a reason to buy into the American dream, like all of us have been able to do it to a certain extent in this room, you'll see dramatic changes in people's behaviors and what they believe and what they don't believe in.
Thank you for your explanation of what an assault rifle is in reality. It is a semi-automatic rifle, correct?
That is correct.
And is an AR-15 the only type of semi-automatic rifle on the market?
There's a multitude of guns. I mean, there's so many manufacturers out there, building guns. You have a lot of choices. But one thing I wanted to point out that I brought up in my statement, when you pull the trigger on a AR, it is no different when you pull the trigger on a pistol or shotgun. Only one bullet comes out.
Well, that's an important point because I think a lot of people are under the misimpression that it's an automatic weapon, for example.
That is correct.
In terms of the mechanism by which a semi-automatic rifle works, is it in principle any different from, let's say, a semi-automatic pistol or other semi-automatic weapon?
The similarities are pretty even in terms of and I'm not a gunsmith and I'm not a person that puts together guns, but when you buy a pistol or you're buying a shotgun, the mechanism to pull the trigger is relatively the same. One pull of the trigger will produce one bullet coming out of that particular gun.
So if Congress were to take up the suggestion of banning assault weapons, a semi-automatic weapon, is there any reason in principle why that same ban would not apply to other types of firearms?
I'll say this, and I appreciate the answer, the question, Senator. I say this a lot to my folks. Gun rights and gun violence are 2 separate conversations and 2 separate events. But what happens when we have this deeply passionate conversation, we merge those 2, and we refuse to look at the nuances. To me, if we're really serious about helping folks, stop looking at restriction after restriction after restriction, law after law after law after law. It's obvious. You can throw 100 laws on that wall right there, and I can fill this room up with a whole bunch of folks that back my position. But we need to look at what's going to really solve the issue, and that's looking at the human condition. And that's what we're all failing to do in this room right now. People are hurting, people are scared, and people are in trouble.
You're familiar, aren't you, with the fact that 60% of the gun deaths in America are suicides? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. For me, this is a very emotional hearing. On May 14th, an 18-year-old was killed 10 people in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, using an assault weapon. A week later, an 18-year-old killed 19 children and 2 teachers at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, using an assault weapon. On the 4th of July, a 21-year-old killed 7 people and injured dozens more at a community parade in Highland Park, Illinois, using an assault weapon. And just this past weekend, a 20-year-old killed 3 people and injured 2 others at a shopping mall in Greenwood, Indiana, using an assault weapon. The 41 people killed in these 4 shootings in just the past 2 months, think about that. They would all still be with us today if it were not for the easy access that people, and particularly young people, have to assault weapons. I also believe it's Congress's job to make sure we're safe going to the grocery store, to school, to parades, and to shopping malls. And that safety is not happening. I believe the solution is simple. We must ban assault weapons. Assault weapons are basically weapons of war. They have no place in our communities. The federal assault weapons ban was in place from 1994 to 2004. A 2016 study showed that during that time, the number of gun massacres fell by 37%, and the number of people dying from gun massacres fell by 43%. In the 10 years after the ban lapsed, there was a 183% increase in massacres and a 239% increase in massacre deaths. So it's clear that the assault weapons ban helped make our communities safer. And I strongly believe we must pass it again. Dr. Hunter, how do assault weapons differ from other types of firearms? And do you believe a ban on assault weapons would be effective?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And as a native Californian, it's great to see you as well. So when we talk about these weapons, there's a lot of discussion around semi-automatic versus automatic versus 3-round bursts, and that refers to a firing mechanism. Right? Each time you pull the trigger, 1 bullet comes out. But there are far different characteristics between different types of weapons. Shotguns, you pull trigger 1 time, 1 bullet comes out, very different type of round, very different muzzle velocity. So if we start just with there is quite a bit of medical research that shows that the combination of the .223 or a .556 round, because a lot of this does come from the military medical community as well, in combination with the muzzle velocity on these weapons do a incredible amount of damage to the human body, and that's what they were designed to do. And that is substantially different than a 9mm round that was designed for a clean entry kill type wound, as opposed to a round that was designed to not just kill, but also maim and disable and disarm. And if you injure someone, have a far greater extent for injury, which is something that is good for combat, but we're seeing it happen here that we have. There's also some substantial differences of just the size and the creation of this rifle. It was designed to be lighter. If we look at the M16 as opposed to the M1, which was the previous service weapon, there's a 3-pound differential. So this is a lighter, more maneuverable weapon than several of the other hunting rifles that you might see there, that you commonly see. So I think it's important that when we talk about weapons, we talk about more than just whether they are semi-automatic or fully automatic, because the The caliber, the muzzle velocity, the weight, the maneuverability, all of these are characteristics of the weapons that are as important as well.
Thank you. I authored the assault weapons legislation that was law, and I have introduced legislation for this session. I also, following the tragic attack in Buffalo, a bill called the Age 21 Act, alongside some of my Senate colleagues, including several members of this committee. And this bill would prohibit the sale of assault-style weapons and high-capacity magazines to anyone under the age of 21. The shooters in Buffalo, Uvalde, Highland Park, and Greenwood all obtained their assault weapons when they were under the age of 21. If this bill had been law, it would have prevented these 4 shooters from killing a combined 41 people. And so it's rather simple, I think. If you can't buy a handgun, you shouldn't be able to buy an assault weapon. Dr. Hunter, do you believe prohibiting the sale of assault weapons to individuals who are under the age of 21 would help protect our communities from gun violence?
What the evidence, there isn't a whole lot of research around age restrictions, but it continued what the evidence does show us is that these weapons, when used in mass shootings, create a disproportionate number of injuries and death that we have. And speaking from the science, that is what we know, that when these show up in mass shootings, there is more injuries and death.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein.
Thank you.
Senator Hirono? Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Grassley is returning.
I want to tell you, I went to the Senate floor and I couldn't get time to give my speech, so I came back here.
Glad to have you.
Mr. Bentley, I want to follow on your expertise. You heard me talk about the bill I have in to involve greater the Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center. You spoke to that as well. Whether it's schools or places of worship or other community organizations, it seems to me it's a step we ought to take. Is behavioral threat assessment the best method to identify an individual mobilizing towards violence and intercede before a violent act is committed?
That question. The process of behavior threat assessment coupled with emergency preparedness training and physical security measures help provide safer schools, places of worship, and safer communities if they are coupled together with fidelity. And individuals are educated in that process.
Behavioral threat assessment for you again are utilized by schools, workplaces, civil society organizations so that folks closest to the person moving towards violence can recognize the signs and, if appropriate, involve law enforcement. There are some who don't believe that we should be involving law enforcement with a person who is getting closer and closer to violence, in part because they distrust police. Do you believe that organizations who desire to implement a behavioral threat assessment program should have access to training necessary to implement such programs?
And that's one of the things that I'm here for, is that a number of the schools and organizations, places of worship that we work with, aren't getting the good information that's out there and that training that would enable them to better recognize and inform individuals who are in positions to make decisions about situations that are occurring. So better education of school employees, from the superintendent down to the individuals that work in the lunchroom, would be beneficial in providing safe and more secure learning environments.
Mr. Smith, your organization filed an amicus brief in the New York Rifle Association versus Bruin case In that case, you cited you cited discriminatory and racial motivations behind gun control policies. Can you tell me how gun control policies like bans on semi-automatic rifles and magazine restrictions negatively impact minorities like members of your organization?
Thank you, Senator. I'll give you a great example. Oftentimes in my organization, as I said, we have over 48,000 members, very robust, very active. Oftentimes I'll get an email from a single black mom who's living in a quote-unquote challenged area who says, "Hey, Phil, I just bought a AR-15. Thank you for the organization. Thank you for the training," because she now feels she's able to protect herself. If you implement a lot of these proposals that I'm hearing today, lots and lots of black single women, lots of black men who are trying to get protection in these tough neighborhoods, hood, whatever you want to call it, are not going to be able to do that. That's why they're discriminatory in their long-term effect on our community. So I'm opposed to anything along those lines.
Could you tell me why bans on so-called assault weapons and standard capacity magazines are not effective and only serve to limit an individual's constitutionally protected right to self-defense?
Because the bans don't work. That was been proven in the 90s. They just do not work. They only prevent my community to having the best tool possible to protect themselves. And I'll say this, for my family, it's the best firearm to protect my wife, my children, my property. It's a very good tool when used by a law-abiding citizen. That's why it's very important for us to have that access to that particular weapon.
Thank you.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hunter, would you consider the gun violence in our country a national health issue?
Absolutely, it is a public national health issue.
Public health issue. And therefore, as a public health issue, shouldn't we be able to have a lot more information about the incidence of gun violence and perhaps why black women, for example, would go out and buy guns in this environment?
Absolutely. Evidence-based public health approaches to solving problems is something that is essential. We have seen it with motor vehicle accidents. We have seen it in approaching the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And meaningful solutions to include legislation as well as, public investiture in private companies to make better decisions, as well as informing consumers to make better decisions, comes from transparent data. And right now, as researchers, we don't have that data to give you the best information possible to make the laws a comprehensive set of laws that are going to keep us safe.
I agree with you. And as our colleague testified, that gun death is the highest cause of death for young people in our country, and you would think that we would want to better understand the causalities and what we can do. Professor Bloker, is that how you pronounce your name? Bloker, sorry. So after Bruin, I would say that there's going to be a lot of questions about various state laws that may fit within the Bruin kind of a situation, including, by the way, Hawaii. I don't know if you're familiar with the fact that Hawaii has some of the strictest gun laws in the country and probably the lowest gun violence rate in our country. And already after Bruin, the Supreme Court has already sent a case challenging Hawaii's laws back to the Ninth Circuit for a new ruling. So after Bruin, would you expect a lot more challenges to state laws such as in Hawaii's case? And what does that do for states' efforts to lower gun violence in their states?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Not only would I expect it, I think we've already seen it. Cases that have been sent back down for further consideration in light of historical record, issues which we thought to be resolved by prior Second Amendment cases, including the constitutionality of prohibitions like Highland Park's municipal assault weapons ban, I think absolutely will be relitigated. My hope and expectation is that judges will recognize what then Judge Amy Coney Barrett wrote in a dissenting opinion when she was on the Seventh Circuit, which is that history is consistent with common sense, and the framing generation understood that dangerous persons could be disarmed. Likewise, they understood that dangerous and unusual weapons could be prohibited, and so I hope that the jurisprudence continues to reflect that fact.
Well, after Bruin, do you think that this Supreme Court will sustain a national ban on assault weapons? No, do you think that this court would support a state's ban on assault weapons? And what about bans on large capacity magazines? Do you think that this Supreme Court will sustain such bans at either the national or state levels?
One of the difficult things about answering the question is the degree to which Bruin has introduced uncertainty, but here's how I would think it through. In the lead up to Bruin, anyway, such laws had fared extremely well in Second Amendment litigation, so there is a jurisprudence that already exists. Courts upheld these laws under a variety of different rationales, some concluding that those weapons are dangerous and unusual and therefore fall outside the scope of the Second Amendment, some courts concluding that the government had a sufficient interest and that these laws are sufficiently tailored to that interest. Some of those certainly will be relitigated. Here's, I think, three factors at least we could consider in predicting the Supreme Court's response. One is that the court has again affirmed that dangerous and unusual weapons can be prohibited. And in Heller, an opinion by Justice Scalia, the court equated dangerous and unusual weapons with M16s and the like. And for all the reasons you've heard today, AR-15s and M16s are different, but they are similar, and the like may include AR-15s as well. There's an argument that these weapons are in common use. The National Shooting Sports Foundation often points to the fact that 20 million of them have been sold in the past few decades. I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of that number, but I would say that 20 million assault weapons in circulation in the past few decades does not mean 20 million assault weapons owners. That ownership is probably concentrated in a much smaller proportion of gun owners who themselves are a minority of the American population. So we're maybe talking about maybe 4 or 5 million Americans out of 300 plus million. Also, 20 million weapons is only 5% of the civilian weapons stock. I'm not sure that constitutes common or not. What I would really want to know to be able to evaluate the question, what I hope the Supreme Court would ask in light of Bruin, which directs us to consider the burdens on self-defense, is how often are these weapons used in self-defense in comparison to their use in gun massacres and mass shootings? We heard today an earlier example where one was, but when Maryland's prohibition on assault weapons was challenged, neither the challengers nor law enforcement could point to a single example of a Marylander using an assault weapon for self-defense. And if that's the case, and if we take the industry and Justice Thomas, for that matter, at their word that these are modern sporting rifles, then I think they're 2 times removed from the historical interest in self-defense.
Well, the thing is, the Supreme Court is not asking the question of whether or not or how often these kinds of assault weapons, however way we describe them, are used in self-defense. See, that is not the question they're asking. They're asking whether it's dangerous and unusual. When you have 20 million of these kinds of items in our environment, that's not particularly unusual. That's why this is a Supreme Court that is moving us toward enabling more and more people to own all kinds of guns, and we are already awash in guns in our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for being here today. And Mayor, certainly we extend our condolences and our sympathies to you all in Highland Park, as we do with all of the victims that have faced this type of violence. And I think it's fair to say that we all share the goal of safe communities and making certain that our children are safe in school, making certain that we can celebrate when we have a July 4th parade or a community event. And as we work on this issue, and you look at cities like Chicago and Philadelphia with very strict gun laws, and then you say, how do we get to the crux of this issue and make certain that people are safe? And Mr. Bentley, I want to come to you. I appreciate some of the work that you've done on the issue of mental health. And as we look at this pattern among some of the last several mass shootings, we see that shooters have previously expressed desires to commit violence, like the criminal there in Highland Park, and the police even having responded to a clear and present danger call on that shooter after he had made death threats. So Mr. Bentley, talk a little bit about how we can enhance mental health programs and awareness so that potential shooters are stopped before they commit some of these crimes of violence.
Thank you for that question. And that's the crux of what the additional resources to help do the research and to provide mental health, particularly as it relates to school safety. A lot of our children are coming out of situations involving trauma, and they need that support so that they can function, providing that help in communities.
Okay, can I get you to link that to your work with behavioral threat assessments and those early warning signs?
Yes, ma'am. That's part of the situation that the center pointed out in their research, that in order to make the behavioral threat assessment process work effectively, it has to be coupled with providing a climate and also providing the situation where those individuals that work in the schools understand what we're looking for and who to report that information to in a timely manner, and also provide those individuals that are crying out with that help that they need. And very often, those individuals are not receiving that help, particularly mental health.
So what you need is a greater jurisdiction or latitude at the state and local level so that communities can respond to need. Am I perceiving that right?
The work that we're doing with K-12 schools involve preparing these schools, those individuals in the schools, with the tools necessary.
Okay. Thank you for that. Mr. Smith, I want to come to you, if I may. There was just a mention about not being sure how many defensive gun uses there were every year. The CDC estimates that there are between 60,000 and 2.5 million defensive gun uses every year. And they also estimate that there are 39,700 gun-related deaths every year in the U.S. And you have talked a little bit about the importance of a firearm, possession of a firearm for self-defense. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to elaborate on that while I have a few seconds left.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's critically important, particularly for my community, to have access to protect themselves at a very basic human level. For years and years, as probably everyone knows in this room, we have not had access to firearms like other communities outside of the Black community. So my organization goes out and literally educates our folks on what a gun is, what a gun isn't, how to purchase a gun, how to hold a gun, how to get trained in going to the range, all the intimate things that you need to know as a firearm and gun owner. We go over those things with our community. That's why our organization has such a strong following, and our folks are very, very trained when they go to the range. You just don't jump into our organization, grab a gun, and run to the range. That doesn't happen that way. All of our sessions are certified, and all of our folks know how to handle the gun at a very intimate level. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why we're doing so well.
Well, thank you all so much. I think we all can agree that we want to keep our community safe, and I thank you all so much for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Let me note for the record the presence of Congressman Brad Schneider, who represents Highland Park. Thank you, Brad, for being with us. And let me also note for the record that Chicago is not Highland Park. I'm proud to represent both communities. There are challenges in both communities, but Highland Park is in a separate county, for those who are not familiar, and is not the same jurisdiction as the city of Chicago. The gun violence problem in Chicago is a serious one, but much different than the shooting incident that occurred on July 4th that brings us together today. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Senator. As a proud graduate of University of Chicago Law School, I knew that, and I appreciate you sharing it with the rest of the committee. Dr. Hunter, thank you for your service in the Marine Corps. I'm from a state, Minnesota, with a strong tradition of hunting and fishing, and I have talked with many gun owners like yourself who support the Second Amendment but believe in common sense gun safety measures, including banning assault weapons. I always look at these proposals and ask myself, would this hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand? And could you explain, as a gun owner, combat veteran who grew up sports shooting, based on your knowledge of guns, does my Uncle Dick need an assault weapon in his deer stand?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. One of these times I'll get the microphone to work correctly when I press it the first time too. And you know, as someone who has spent time around guns my entire life, in my opinion, a AR-15 is not an ideal weapon for deer hunting, and so your Uncle Dick likely will not be using one for deer hunting.
Okay, thank you. Part of what makes assault weapons so dangerous is their high rate of fire, as you know, which is also true when handguns are actually modified with conversion devices that actually turn them into fully automatic weapons. These devices can be purchased from foreign manufacturers for under $20 and can be installed in under a minute. That's why this week I am introducing legislation with Senator Gary Peters of Michigan to require federal law enforcement to coordinate with local law enforcement to crack down on these illegal devices. Do you agree that keeping illegal conversion devices off of our streets will also help save lives?
Thank you for the question on that. What the research shows us about these weapons is that when they are used, there is a higher rate of injury and death. And some of the research around the initial federal assault weapons ban did show that there was ways to essentially make copycat weapons and to it have the same effects as the weapons that were intended to be banned. And so while I haven't seen the exact legislation, what the research does show us is that anything that increases a rate of fire or increases the deadliness of a weapon will lead to more injuries and deaths.
Thank you. Mayor, thank you for your leadership that you've shown your community and really the nation. Last week I met with survivors from the horrific shooting in Highland Park, kids, parents, and I also met with another group from Uvalde, where I spoke with a 10-year-old girl who was in the classroom next door during the Robb Elementary shooting. It was her friend. She was in the same grade that she lost. She had pictures of the friends, which she had on a little button that she wore around her neck. It really brought home to me that tragedy didn't end, of course, not in the classroom. It didn't even end at the funerals. It didn't end at the hospital. It continues for the families. There isn't just one victim. Could you talk about the long-term impacts that you expect to see in Highland Park and how people are dealing with their grief?
We are still a community trying to figure out the next step to healing. We observed a moment of silence a week after. We held our vigil with traumatized community members as well as SWAT teams and rooftop sniper teams because people were scared to gather together. And just before this hearing, I spoke with the husband of a survivor who is still in the ICU, who, here we are, 2.5 weeks later, is still fighting for preserving her ability to live her life as she has in the past, and we know obviously about Cooper Roberts. There is a lot of physical and emotional pain that we will all be carrying with us, but for a lot of folks, their lives will never be the same. We are trying to figure out how do we get our children to feel safe going into school next month. And while I wholeheartedly appreciate and support all of the mental health efforts and the school hardening efforts and the red flag laws and everything that everyone is trying to do, at the bottom line, we know that moving forward as a community, moving forward as a nation, we need to get combat weapons out of civilian hands. So I appreciate the question.
Yes.
It's still a new journey for all of us. It'll be a long journey, but right now, we need these weapons out of civilian hands.
Well said. Well said. And for my very last question, Mr. Chair, and that was so well said, I think it's really important to express the grief, but to turn it into action. And you were there on the White House lawn when the President gave his remarks after signing into law the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I thank so many of us and our colleagues who worked on that. In that were provisions that many of us, in my case, the boyfriend loophole, closing that bill that I'd worked on for 10 years, and we finally get it done. Could you explain, as we look at the next steps we must take, how we cannot wait 10 years or another 10 years or another 50 years to do something when it comes to the threat posed by assault weapons?
Highland Park was number 309, and now we're already up to 350 mass shootings in the last 16 days. That many more have been added to the list. There is so much to be celebrated in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and we thank you all for your efforts. But my gosh, how much more needs to happen before this obvious action is taken? We know that there are mental health issues in other countries throughout this world. We know that there are troubled people who are inclined towards violence. What's the differentiating factor? Combat weapons and access to civilians. There's no place for these weapons. I appreciate and share deep concern about the gun violence issues in the city of Chicago and all of our nation's large cities and frankly elsewhere. But at the end of the day, today's hearing is about how do we reduce mass shootings. We reduce mass shootings by getting rid of combat weapons in civilian hands.
Well said. Thank you.
Senator Cruz.
The state of Illinois, like the state of Texas, is dealing with yet another horrific mass murder. Inevitably, when a crime of this sort occurs, a political debate bursts out in Washington within instance. Everyone on this committee, everyone in this room, wants to prevent the next mass murder. Everyone is horrified at the criminals who would take the lives of children, take the lives of the innocent, and we're horrified at the steadily increasing rates of murders, whether in the city of Chicago, in cities across the country, or whether in my home state, in the beautiful elementary school of Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas. The question is how to do so. How do you stop mass murders? There are two approaches. One approach is target the bad guys, target the felons, target the fugitives, target those with serious mental illness, prosecute them, put them in jail. When they try to illegally buy firearms, prosecute them and get them off the street. And at the same time, enhance the security of vulnerable locations in our society. That includes schools, that includes churches, it includes places that these deranged murderers have been targeted. That's the approach that I believe works. There's a second approach, which the Democrat members of this committee support, which is gun control, which is targeting law-abiding citizens and disarming law-abiding citizens. That second approach doesn't work. It's consistently ineffective. If the objective is stop mass murders, gun control doesn't work. The state of Illinois has among the strictest gun control laws of any state in the country. Highland Park has even stricter gun control laws than the state of Illinois. Consistently, if you look across the country at the jurisdictions with the strictest gun control laws, almost without exception, they have the highest crime rates and the highest murder rates. It's not complicated why when you disarm law-abiding citizens. The result is the criminals don't follow the laws, they have the guns, and the law-abiding citizens are unable to defend themselves. Now, we saw on Sunday another deranged murder, a killer fired into a crowd in Greenwood Park Mall in Greenwood, Indiana. Within 15 seconds, That killer was shot and killed by 22-year-old Eli Dicken, who thankfully was carrying a concealed handgun. Many more lives would have been lost in Indiana that day if Mr. Dicken had not been there, had not exercised his Second Amendment right, and had not saved the lives of the innocent there. That's not an exception. It's not unusual. According to the Obama White House, firearms are used defensively to stop a crime in the United States of America between 500,000 and 1 million times every year. Whenever you have a deranged murderer committing a crime, there are two and only two ways they stop. Number one, law enforcement stops them. Or number two, an individual citizen who is armed stops them. Those are the two ways. If we want to stop crimes, we need to get the criminals off the streets, and we need to increase law enforcement. Now, we just had a debate on gun control, and the Democrats passed a bill with some Republican support that I think is likely to do nothing to prevent violent crime. It satisfied a political agenda, but it is unlikely to stop the next mass murder. I submitted a bill, Cruz-Barrasso, which would have prosecuted violent criminals, gotten them off the streets. It would have created a national Project Exile so that if the criminal commits a crime with a gun, he faces federal prosecution and mandatory jail time, so the trigger pullers are not there to commit crimes. And Cruz-Barrasso would have doubled the number of police officers in schools. And it would have devoted an additional $10 billion to mental health counselors in schools to stop these troubled young boys and men who so often are the trigger pullers committing these crimes. Unfortunately, the Democrats on this committee and every Democrat in the Senate voted against Cruz-Barrasso because a proposal that actually is devoting resources to law enforcement, to stopping the murderers, to preventing the crimes, to getting the murderers off the streets, that is not politically advantageous. Their objective is disarm the law-abiding citizens. Indeed, many of the Democrats on this committee would happily ban concealed handguns, which would have disarmed Eli Dicken and would have resulted in a lot more people being murdered. Many of the Democrats on this committee would ban AR-15s, which would have disarmed Stephen Williford, who stopped the Sutherland Springs mass murderer with his AR-15 and saved lives. This topic is serious. I commend the witnesses for being here. I wish the members of this committee treated it with the seriousness to actually ask what stops crime and stops murders, because the political solutions this body has put forward does not do that. And instead of the political bill that is not going to stop crime, we should have passed Cruz-Barrasso and doubled the number of cops in schools and stopped murderers from committing their crimes.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Barely a month after the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas, the community of Highland Park joined the ranks of those that have experienced the uniquely American epidemic of mass shootings. While the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was a critical step in addressing the problem, we must now turn to the issue of unfettered civilian access to military-style assault weapons and the laws that enable them to be obtained. Again, these are weapons designed for the battlefield, not hunting, not communities. These are assault weapons, not pistols. The threat posed by these instruments of slaughter is robbing our communities of safe spaces. People should not have to live in fear of what happened in Uvalde and Highland Park. We owe it to all Americans who have been impacted by senseless gun violence over the years to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Now, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act will provide $750 million in funding to support crisis intervention services, including state red flag laws. We've begun to touch on it earlier in the hearing. Now, these laws allow community members like families, police officers, and doctors to petition judges to issue firearm restraining orders for individuals who they believe pose a threat to themselves or others. Robert Crimo exemplified many questionable characteristics that should have made him unfit for gun ownership. For example, Highland Park Police responded to an incident in 2019 where Crimo made threats against his family. It's documented. They confiscated 16 knives, a dagger, and a sword, and ultimately filed a report declaring him a clear and present danger. Between April and September of 2019, he reportedly attempted suicide, threatened to kill his family, and told police that he had been depressed and was using drugs. Crimo also made social media posts glorifying mass shootings. Signs were there. Yet despite all this, he was approved for a license and purchased several firearms, including the semi-automatic rifle he used to carry out his attack on 4th of July. Now, this likely is not the only instance in which red flag laws should have been invoked, but weren't. In the first 2 years in which Illinois' red flag law was in effect, only 53 firearm restraining orders were filed, with nearly half of them coming from a single suburban county outside Chicago. In 2020 and 2021, judges issued only 115 restraining orders, less than 5 per month statewide. My question, Mayor Rotering, I want to thank you for your testimony and for your leadership during this devastating time for your community. Our hearts go out to you. Now, although we know that red flag laws save lives, their usefulness is limited to the extent that people actually know about them. What suggestions do you have for promoting awareness of the purpose and applicability of these laws so that they are more effective?
I appreciate the efforts of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and the willingness to recognize that those closest to our potential shooters are best at assessing their risk, but a burden is placed on them. I agree that there's an opportunity to move forward, to stop people from being able to access FOIDs and access weapons, but at the end of the day, those weapons, and particularly these assault weapons, just shouldn't be available, period. All of these stopgaps are excellent efforts, and we support them, but let's be clear. The differentiating factor between the U.S. and the rest of the world is assault weapons are available. So yes, red flags we need to promote, we need to show the world that this is available, but we're putting a burden on people who may already be dealing with the difficulties of having a mentally ill family member, trying to work through that balance of keeping them safe and keeping themselves safe. It's important to have red flag laws, but we need to get rid of combat weapons.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And that's where as much great work that was done to pass this bipartisan measure, we need to continue the fight to ban assault weapons, to ban large capacity magazines. I agree, couldn't agree more. But the fact that we did take these steps, as skeptical as some people may have been at the beginning, well, it's not the ban, but there is a lot to be said for enhanced background checks, even if it's for buyers under 21. I wish it was for everybody, nationally. The investments in mental health. But the red flag laws, they're not the complete solution in and of themselves, but they will help save lives if implemented more broadly. Not every state has their own laws, and it's contingent upon public awareness that they exist. So look forward to some follow-up with you and the other witnesses on how to better implement and raise awareness about them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It's important to state my police did everything right.
Yep.
And they followed the rules. And they tried everything that they had at their disposal to make sure that these weapons weren't able to be obtained. And yet, here we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, I actually feel you in a lot of what you've been saying today, and as a time that people just want to sink into partisan divisiveness, I want to just affirm the fact that you and I agree on a lot of things, with the exception of the fact that the omegas are better than the alphas. So you don't get to return, I get to ask the questions. So let's just be clear. We know the history of African Americans and the entire history of this country being overwhelmingly the victims of horrific violence, from the killing of 4 girls in a bombing in Birmingham to the killing of Breonna Taylor asleep in her own house, from massacres that have happened like Tulsa, Oklahoma, including massacres like we saw in a church in South Carolina. You would agree about the natural instinct for communities to want to defend themselves, like Black Panthers did in Oakland or in, as you're seeing with black women now, correct?
Absolutely.
So you and I also agree that we need to, with urgency, end this kind of violence in the United States of America. You said that in your testimony. And so I want to point out some things that I find outrageous that I actually think you probably find outrageous too. So the first is that we don't invest in communities so violence doesn't happen in the first place. And it's something you said already, correct, like finding jobs. Number 2, I introduced a bill called Break the Cycle of Violence Act that was included in the bipartisan compromise to do community violence intervention, because from Oakland to New York City, there are strategies that are about empowering communities that actually lower violence. You agree with me on that?
Absolutely.
You and I agree that most of the crimes happening in communities like ours, I'm the only senator, to my knowledge, that lives in a low-income black and brown community for the last 25 years. And what kills me is that every single shooting when I was mayor, except for one that we could find, happened with a person who was not qualified to buy a gun that was able to get that gun. You agree in general that's the truth, right?
Repeat that last part.
That most of the crimes in communities like ours are happening because people who do not qualify to buy a gun, criminals, find a way to get a gun, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and so you and I would probably agree that this nation should have universal, thorough background checks, correct?
Yes, I support background checks.
I know you do. Number 2, the trace data. When these crimes happen in communities like mine, the clearance rates on murders is so low that the communities are like, why can't we get the bad people behind? But yet we have laws that prevent people from doing research on trace data. You think that's absurd, yes?
I would agree, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. You don't have to hesitate so much. I'm not trying to trap you here, man.
No, it's okay, it's okay.
Okay, so here you and I could go down a long list of things that would make all of us safer that we don't do because friends of mine block us in this body that would make communities like yours and mine a lot safer, correct? We can find bipartisan things that we could do today. Like take the ATF. It's the one law enforcement organization. We've increased budgets massively for every law enforcement, but we hand strap the ATF and don't allow them to do their job. We don't allow them to keep computer records of things that are going on. That's kind of absurd to stop law enforcement from doing their job, right?
I think where you and I differ, and I see a lot of similarities.
Especially haircut, but go ahead.
Beautiful hair, beautiful hair. I think when it comes down to looking at, let's be clear, I believe that having an AR-15 is a value add to my family.
Sir, I'll get to the AR-15. I'm just trying to establish the foundation.
We have commonality, sure, but there's differences. There's
but Americans have a lot of agreement on this issue, even folks that are Republican witness and some Democrat from Jersey. So let me just switch to one thing, though, that I take issue with, but turn to Hunter, and you can talk to me later.
Sure.
You said that pulling a trigger, AR-15, pulling a trigger, it's just one trigger. These are similar than a pistol or a shotgun. At the top of my block a few years ago, Shahad Smith was killed with an assault rifle. The police and one of the police officers said to me, it was as if when that bullet hit him, his head exploded. Can you explain for the record the difference between a one-shot pistol versus one of these assault weapons that are used in war zones?
From a functional standpoint, there is no difference between a...
Sir...
But hold on, let me answer. You asked the question, let me answer. When you take a shotgun, an AR, or a rifle, it's a one-trigger system.
Yes.
Are some systems or some shotguns or rifles stronger than others? Absolutely. But the mechanics are the same.
I don't disagree with anything that you said. Everything you said there is factual. But would you, Ms. Hunter, Dr. Hunter, excuse me, would you please explain?
Thank you very much. So this weapon was chosen by the United States Army in Vietnam because it was designed to shoot through a standard issue military helmet at 500 yards. It was designed to kill someone wearing a military helmet at 500 yards. So what that does to a civilian who's wearing nothing, a baseball cap, is liquefy organs. That is the intent of this round. Yes, one trigger pull, but this round, the way it was designed, was to do as much damage as quickly as possible and to kill enemy soldiers wearing a standard issue military helmet.
And I'm just going to close it because I'm out of time, and I want to ask the mayor a question. But that is the point. These bullets hit bodies and they liquefy organs. I have seen too many shootings in my community. The ones done with pistols, people are more likely to survive. The ones done with these guns, they cause unbelievable damage. It takes one pull of a trigger to fire a grenade, one pull of a trigger to fire a pistol. There is a big difference between weapons of war and these weapons. Mayor, I have too much experience with seeing my children die. And God bless our police officers in the United States of America. I have not seen heroism, except for in war periods, about men and women running towards gunfire with no situational awareness. I am not joking. When I see one of my police officers when I go home in Newark, I want to hug them because I know that every day they put on that uniform. If I was their family member, if I was the husband of a police officer, you worry about them. And what your officers did, all the stories I hear, you should be so proud. And I'm sorry, though, that you have to feel that pride. What I don't think folks understand is the true devastation. We mourn the loss of life, and that is uncalculable. But when these traumatic events happen to a town, the true cost is so much greater. I've seen businesses close. I've seen people who are so traumatized that they hear a firework go off on the next 4th of July and they dive for cover. Could you just, closing, and then I'll return it to the chairperson, try to help people understand that the regularity of these mass shootings in our communities is doing a deeper damage than I think America can even understand, and that it is a matter of time, that we're at the point now that mayors all around America, we know, I'm sorry, I'm a former mayor, we know that this is just a matter of time, that today we're talking about Highland Park. Tomorrow we could be talking about another town, another mosque, another grocery store, another church, another school. Could you please just try to capture that one more time?
So I flew in with the mayor of Buffalo just by happenstance, and several of my surrounding region mayors are here with me today. And we all know it's not if, but when. And the pain of being in a 4th of July parade and getting that call and thinking, no, not us, not now, not today. And I don't know what we're going to do next 4th of July. I have people who tell me they will never go to a parade again. I have people who tell me we need to do the biggest parade ever. How do we reclaim normalcy in our community? I don't know. And I will be reaching out to the many mayors who called me in the hours, literally within an hour of this shooting, who have gone through this painful experience, to say to them, how do we move forward? I've been in touch with several of them regularly. I don't know why this needs to be our new normal. I don't know why we need to live this way. And I, frankly, need a better explanation to the students who have to go back to the classroom in a month to be able to say to them, don't worry, we've got you. When I talked to students in my community, they all said to me, oh yeah, we knew this was coming, not from this particular instance, but every single one of them said, we've been waiting for this our whole lives. We've been training for this our whole lives. And they knew what to do, and they thought it would be at school. Heaven help us all. There's no way to live when you're living in this kind of fear, and I am so concerned, not just for my community, but for our country. This needs to stop.
If there's anything I can do to help your community.
Thank you, Senator Booker, and thanks to this panel. What happened today in the United States Capitol is a demonstration of what we do in America. when we experience tragedies like the tragedy at Highland Park, many people just walk away, close the doors, and say, I don't want to talk about it. Others say, I want to talk about this. I want to do something about this. I want to make sure it never happens again. To the residents of Highland Park who came here, and neighbors as well, today for this hearing, you've taken that extra step. America will notice that. They should. Because you care and I care, we all care together that this never happens again. And yet we know in reality it already has, and it will again. You saw a good illustration today of the political aspects of this issue involving guns, why we tend to do so little. Once every 30 years, we're going to do a gun safety bill? God forbid, if that is what happened. The question that we need to ask ourselves as politicians, and you need to join us in asking, was Highland Park a tipping point? Was it a moment when America stopped to reflect on assault weapons? Uvalde, Texas seems to have been. It really motivated a lot of people on both sides of the aisle to finally talk about subjects that were ignored for years. But when it comes to assault weapons, combat weapons, and what they did in Highland Park, are we ready for this conversation? I don't know the answer to that. I do this for a living, and I don't know the answer to that for sure. I will tell you, I don't believe AR-15 is just another gun. I think it is a killing machine, and we have ample testimony under oath that it is. And we sell them by the millions in this country, by the millions. I can't explain that. I will take exception to one statement made by a senator from the other side of the aisle. He questioned, quote, the seriousness of our effort. How could he do that? In light of what you have been through, what America has been through with guns, how could you question any good faith attempt to reduce gun violence in this country? We may draw different conclusions and have different approaches, but for goodness sakes, there is nothing more serious than what happened on the 4th of July in Highland Park. And I want to remind my colleague when he raises that question that I think he's gone too far. Your presence today will make a difference with me and with many, and you can tell that from the attendance and participation of members of this committee. We enacted the most serious gun legislation in nearly 30 years with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I voted for it, and I'll tell you, it isn't nearly enough. Not enough for the violence that takes place with these mass shooter incidents, not enough for what goes on in Chicago and other cities like it every single day. And just for the record, Chicago is the whipping boy many times in these hearings. The rate of death by population for gun violence in Chicago is not as great as it is in Rockford, nor in my hometown of East St. Louis, nor as it is in Jackson, Mississippi, or in many other communities. It's terrible. Every life is precious. But to say that it's just a Chicago phenomena, it's not. It's an American phenomena. It's what we're facing and you're facing in a personal way. I thank you for being here today, for caring enough to coming here today, and I thank the members of the panel for their testimony. There may be follow-up questions sent your way. I hope that you'll respond to them in a timely manner. I thank the witnesses again, and this meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee stands adjourned.